August 1944, Normandy, France. The dismissal papers sat on Field Marshal Bernard Shaw's desk like a death sentence waiting for a signature. Clean white paper, crisp military letterhead, a single line that would end a career, General Harold Brennan relieved of command effective immediately. Shaw's hand rested on his fountain pen. He had done this before, removed officers who questioned him, replaced commanders who failed to meet his standards. It never took longer than his morning tea. Sign the paper, make the call, move on. The war had no patience for sentiment, and neither did he. But the man standing across the desk had just said 5 words that made the most powerful British general in Europe hesitate. Try it. Meet the Dominion. Not shouted, not threatened, just stated. A fact delivered in the same tone a man might use to mention rain was coming. Shaw looked up. General Harold Brennan stood at attention, hands at his sides, face calm. 56 years old, thin face, wire-rimmed glasses catching the morning light through the tent flap. He looked exactly like what he was, a bureaucrat in a uniform. A paper pusher who had spent the years between wars arguing over defense budgets in Ottawa offices that smelled like old tobacco and broken dreams. Shaw had fired better men than this. But something in Brennan's eyes made him pause. Something that said the 5 words were not a bluff. Shaw's fingers drummed once on the dismissal papers. Then he pushed them aside. "Get out," Shaw said. Brennan saluted, turned, walked out of the tent into the Normandy morning, where 2 million Allied soldiers were grinding their way across France, and the sound of distant artillery rolled like summer thunder that never stopped. Shaw sat alone with his unsigned papers and the uncomfortable realization that he had just blinked first. To understand those 5 words, you need to go back 2 years. To a beach in France where the water ran red and a man in an Ottawa office learned what it meant to carry other people's names. August 19th, 1942, Dieppe, France. The telegram arrived at the Canadian War Office at 11:43 in the morning. Lieutenant Nathaniel Brennan, Calgary Regiment, killed in action during operations at Dieppe. Next of kin, Mrs. Beatrice Garrett, Toronto, Ontario. Harold Brennan was in his office when the casualty lists started coming through. He was a major then, 54 years old, logistics and planning, the kind of officer who understood supply chains and troop movements, but had never heard a shot fired in anger. His war was fought with pencils and requisition forms, and he had made peace with that fact a long time ago. The telegrams came in batches, printed on yellow paper, stacked in wire trays on desks throughout the building. Each one a son or brother or father who had woken up that morning on a ship in the English Channel and would never wake up again. Brennan's hands were steady as he sorted them, alphabetical order, by unit, by hometown. Making sense of chaos was what he did. It was the only thing he knew how to do when the world stopped making sense on its own. He saw the name before his brain registered what it meant. Brennan, N., Lieutenant, Calgary Regiment, Nathaniel, his sister Beatrice's boy. 22 years old, blonde hair that never stayed combed, a laugh that filled rooms. The kid who used to follow Harold around family gatherings asking questions about military history until Beatrice would pull him away, apologizing for her son's enthusiasm. The telegram sat in Harold's hand. Yellow paper, black ink, 14 words that meant Beatrice's world had just ended, and Harold would have to be the one to tell her. He picked up the telephone, dialed the Toronto number he knew by heart, waited through 4 rings, each one stretching longer than the last. "Hello," Beatrice's voice, cheerful, unaware. "B, it's Harold." A pause. She knew. Sisters always know when brothers call with bad news. "Is it Nate?" "Yes." The sound she made was not a scream. It was something worse, a crack, like something structural giving way inside a person. Harold held the phone away from his ear but could still hear it. The sound of a mother learning her son was dead. When she could speak again, her voice was barely a whisper. How? Dieppe. The raid this morning. He was killed in action. Did he suffer? Harold looked at the telegram. It said nothing about suffering. It said nothing about anything except that Lieutenant Nathaniel Brennan was dead. No, Harold lied. It was quick. Another crack in her voice. Thank you for calling. I have to go now. The line went dead. Harold sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. Outside his window, Ottawa was having a beautiful summer day. Sunshine, blue sky, people walking to lunch. The war was 3,000 miles away across an ocean, and here it was just telegrams on yellow paper. He looked at the stacks of casualty reports still waiting to be processed. Hundreds of them, each one a Nathaniel to somebody, each one a phone call that would break someone the way Beatrice had just broken. Harold pulled out a blank sheet of paper and started writing names. Every single one. Brennan Nathaniel, Lieutenant, Calgary Regiment, age 22. Then he went back to the casualty lists and kept writing. Every Canadian killed at Dieppe. Every single one. First name, last name, rank, unit, age when he could find it. By the time he finished, it was dark outside. His hand cramped, his eyes burned. The list covered 3 pages in his precise handwriting. By the time he finished, 907 names filled 3 pages in his precise handwriting. He folded the papers carefully, put them in his breast pocket, right over his heart. The war had been an abstraction until that phone call, supply lines and troop movements and strategic objectives. Now it was Nate's face, Bee's broken voice, nearly 1,000 families learning the worst news in the world. Harold Brennan made a decision that night. He did not write it down, did not tell anyone. But it settled into his bones the way concrete settles when it hardens. Never again would Canadian boys die under British plans without Canadian commanders having a say. Never again would he treat casualty numbers as abstractions. Never again would he forget that every name on every list had a mother somewhere who would answer the phone one day and hear her world end. He carried those 3 folded pages in his pocket every day after that. A reminder, a mission, a debt he owed to his nephew and 906 other boys who went to a French beach and never came home. 2 years is not a long time in the span of a war, but it is enough time for a man to change. Harold Brennan spent those 2 years fighting a different kind of battle. Not with guns, but with memorandums and meetings and carefully worded arguments in rooms where decisions got made that would send other people's nephews to die. The fight was over Canadian command autonomy. A bureaucratic phrase that meant something simple and profound. Canadian soldiers should be led by Canadian generals answering to the Canadian government, not British field marshals who saw them as convenient bodies to fill gaps in the line. It was not a popular position. The British military establishment had been running things for centuries. The idea that a dominion like Canada would demand its own command structure was seen as colonial sentimentality, at best dangerous inefficiency, at worst. You'll get boys killed with this, a British liaison officer told Brennan during one particularly heated meeting in early 1943. Unity of command saves lives. Politics costs them. Brennan thought of Dieppe, of the boys sent into a meat grinder by a plan that made no tactical sense, approved by commanders who had never asked a single Canadian officer if the raid was worth the cost. Dieppe cost 907 Canadian lives under British planning, Brennan said. I will take my chances. The meetings went on for months, Brennan arguing, British officers resisting, Canadian politicians caught between wanting autonomy and not wanting to upset the alliance that was keeping them alive. Brennan's strongest ally was General Elliot Ashford, his predecessor as the designated commander of Canadian forces. Ashford was everything Brennan was not: tall, charismatic, a natural leader who inspired men just by walking into a room. He had spent 3 years building the framework for Canadian command independence fighting, political battles in London and Ottawa, making enemies in the British War Office, who saw him as a troublemaker. In late 1943, the British finally won. Ashford was quietly pushed out, reassigned, sent home with full honours and no real power. The official reason was health concerns. The real reason was that he had pushed too hard for Canadian autonomy, and the British had decided he was more trouble than he was worth. Ashford met with Brennan one last time before he left. They sat in Ashford's nearly empty office boxes, packed walls bare. "I built the framework," Ashford said. "Constitutional precedents, political agreements, it is all there in writing. Canada has the legal right to command its own forces, but legal rights mean nothing if no one is willing to stand on them." He pulled out a folder, thick with documents, copies of every memorandum, every agreement, every legal opinion establishing Canadian command authority. "This is your shield," Ashford said. "When they try to remove you, and they will try, this is what you show them. Not to convince them you are right, but to show them what it will cost if they push." Brennan took the folder. "They removed you. I was not careful enough. I made it about pride, about proving Canadian generals were as good as British ones." Ashford met his eyes. "Make it about the boys, about Dieppe, about names on casualty lists. Make it so they cannot remove you without admitting they see soldiers as numbers, not nephews. That is a fight they cannot win because everyone has a nephew." Brennan carried that folder the same way he carried his list of 907 names, a weapon he hoped he would never have to use but kept loaded just in case. In July 1944, he was promoted to command the 1st Canadian Army, 56 years old. No combat experience, a paper pusher being given one of the most complicated military commands in the European theatre. The 1st Canadian Army was not simply Canadian. It was a multinational force. Canadian divisions, British formations, a Polish armoured division, Belgian units, Czech soldiers, 50,000 men from a dozen countries, all of whom had to be supplied, coordinated, commanded across a front line that stretched through the hell of Normandy's hedgerow country. It was the kind of assignment that could break a general with twice Brennan's experience. Field Marshal Bernard Shaw sent a private letter to General Eisenhower 3 days after Brennan's appointment. The letter was marked confidential, but confidential letters in wartime have a way of not staying confidential. "Brennan is a clerk, not a commander," Shaw wrote. "He lacks the grip necessary for high command. The 1st Canadian Army will require close supervision. I will watch him carefully." The letter made its way back to Brennan through channels that no one ever officially acknowledged. He read it once, folded it, put it in the same pocket where he kept Nate's name and 906 others. Shaw thought he was a clerk. Shaw thought he could be supervised like a subordinate who needed guidance. Shaw had no idea what he was dealing with. August 18th, 1944. The night before the confrontation. Field Marshal Shaw's headquarters tent was warm. A portable heater fought off the evening chill. Maps covered every wall, marked with coloured pins, showing the positions of 2 million Allied soldiers grinding eastward through France. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery provided a constant bass note to the war. Shaw had invited his army commanders to dinner. A working meal, roast beef, wine, cigars, the kind of civilized gathering that reminded everyone they were not barbarians, even in the middle of barbarism. Brennan sat across the table from Shaw. The food was excellent. The wine was French liberated from some chateau cellar. The conversation was about victory timelines and supply routes and the ongoing push toward Germany. Shaw raised his glass. "To victory by Christmas, gentlemen." The other commanders drank. Brennan did not. He held his glass, but did not raise it. Shaw noticed. Shaw noticed everything. "General Brennan, you are quiet this evening. Not celebrating our progress." Brennan looked at the wine in his glass. Ruby red. Expensive. The kind of thing Nate would never taste. would never have the chance to taste. I am thinking of the boys who will not see Christmas, sir. The table went quiet. Not an angry quiet, an uncomfortable one, the kind that happens when someone mentions death at a celebration. Shaw's smile did not quite reach his eyes. We honor their sacrifice by winning, General. That is how war works. Yes, sir, Brennan said, but he did not drink. The dinner continued. Talk shifted to upcoming operations. Shaw was animated when he spoke about strategy. He had beaten Rommel in the desert, led the British forces through Sicily and Italy. Now he commanded every Allied ground unit in northwestern Europe, and he spoke about the enemy the way a chess master speaks about an opponent he knows he is going to beat. Brennan listened and watched. The warm tent, the good food, the confident talk. And he thought about Scheldt, the estuary that controlled access to Antwerp's port. Intelligence reports said clearing it should be the priority. The supply crisis was getting worse every day. Entire armoured divisions sitting idle because there was no fuel to move them. But Shaw was planning something else. Operation Market Garden. An airborne assault deep into Holland. Ambitious. Bold. The kind of operation that would make headlines if it worked. Brennan had read the Market Garden plans. He had questions about them. Questions about whether taking one bridge was worth delaying the operations that would actually solve the supply crisis. But this was not the time to voice those questions, not in a tent full of generals drinking French wine and talking about Christmas. The dinner ended. The commanders stood saluted, dispersed into the night. Brennan walked back to his own headquarters tent. The August air was cool. The sky was clear enough to see stars between the clouds. Artillery rumbled to the east where the real war was happening. He thought about tomorrow, August 19th. 2 years since Dieppe. 2 years since the phone call that broke Beatrice. 2 years of carrying 907 names in his pocket. There would be a memorial service, nothing elaborate, a field chaplain. 200 Canadian soldiers who wanted to pause for 30 minutes and remember the boys who died on a French beach before the war had really even started, for most of them. Shaw had scheduled a commanders' conference for the same time. Standard operational briefing. Nothing urgent, nothing that could not wait an hour. Brennan knew what the smart choice was. Attend the conference. Send his chief of staff to the memorial. Keep Shaw happy. Do not rock the boat. He pulled out the folded papers from his breast pocket. 3 pages, 907 names. Ink faded from 2 years of being carried. Some names smudged from the oils in his fingers. Brennan Nathaniel, Lieutenant. Calgary Regiment, age 22. He had made Beatrice a promise on the phone that day, even though he had not spoken it aloud. The promise was in the lie about Nate not suffering, in the gentleness of his voice when her world ended. The promise was, I will remember him. I will make sure his death meant something. I will make sure no one forgets. Tomorrow, he would keep that promise, and if Shaw did not like it, Shaw could try to do something about it. Brennan folded the papers, put them back in his pocket, went to sleep. He did not know that in less than 12 hours he would say 5 words that would define the rest of his life. August 19th, 1944, morning. The memorial service was held in a field 3 miles from the front line. 200 Canadian soldiers stood in rough formation, no parade ground precision, just tired men in muddy uniforms taking 30 minutes to remember other tired men who had died 2 years ago in a different kind of mud. The chaplain was young, 30 at most. He had not been at Dieppe, he read from notes. 2 years ago today, 907 Canadian soldiers gave their lives at Dieppe. They stormed a beach in the face of impossible odds. They fought with courage. They died far from home. We remember them. The soldiers stood silent. Some had been at Dieppe. You could tell by their faces, the ones who looked at the ground, the ones whose jaws were tight. Brennan stood with them. He had asked for no special recognition, no commander's position at the front. He was just another soldier remembering. The chaplain read names. Not all 907, that would take hours, but a selection, alphabetical, a representation. Brennan Nathaniel, Lieutenant, Calgary Regiment. Harold's hand went to his breast pocket, touched the folded papers there. The chaplain continued through the alphabet, each name a boy who had woken up on August 19th, 1942, and never seen August 20th. When the chaplain finished, there was a minute of silence. 200 men standing in a French field, thinking about the 907, who were not standing anywhere anymore. Brennan thought about Nate. Not the telegram, not the casualty report, but Nate at 15 asking Harold about military tactics at Thanksgiving dinner. Nate at 18 enlisting proud of his uniform. Nate at 22 walking onto a landing craft in the pre-dawn darkness, probably scared, probably trying not to show it. The silence ended. The chaplain said a final prayer. The soldiers dispersed. Brennan stayed for a moment longer. Then he walked back toward headquarters. A messenger was waiting for him outside his tent. Young private, nervous. "Sir, Field Marshal Shaw requests your presence at headquarters immediately. He says you missed the commander's conference." "I was at a memorial service." "Yes, sir, I will tell him." The private left. Brennan went into his tent, changed into a clean uniform, checked his breast pocket. The papers were still there. Ashford's folder was in his desk drawer. He left it there. Either the papers in his pocket would be enough, or nothing would be. He walked to Shaw's headquarters, the same tent where they had eaten dinner the night before. The maps were still on the walls. The heater was still running. But the warmth felt different now, less civilized, more like the heat before a storm. Shaw was behind his desk, standing, beret perfectly positioned. Every inch the field marshal who had beaten Rommel and broken through Normandy and commanded armies with the casual authority of someone who had never been told no. "Sit," Shaw said. Brennan sat. Shaw did not. "You missed my conference this morning." "Yes, sir. I attended a memorial service for the Canadian soldiers killed at Dieppe 2 years ago today." "I am aware of the date." Shaw's voice was cold, clipped. "I am also aware that you sent your chief of staff to my conference in your place. That is not how this command structure functions. With respect, sir, I made a command decision based on my responsibilities to the Canadian government and the men under my care." Shaw leaned forward, both hands on the desk. "Your responsibilities are to this army group, to me, when I call a conference you attend. Is that clear?" Brennan met his eyes. "It is clear what you expect, sir, but I answer to Ottawa as well as to you. That is constitutional reality." Constitutional reality means nothing when men are dying because commanders are not where they need to be. I have removed officers for less than this. The words hung in the air. Not quite a threat, not quite a promise, but close enough to both that the meaning was unmistakable. Brennan thought about Ashford, removed, sent home, made an example of what happened when you pushed too hard. He thought about the folder in his desk drawer. Constitutional precedents, legal opinions, the framework that said Canada had the right to command its own forces. He thought about the papers in his breast pocket. 907 names, 907 reasons he was sitting in this tent having this conversation. And he thought about Nate, about Beatrice's voice breaking over the phone, about every mother who had lost a son because some general somewhere decided their boy was an acceptable casualty in someone else's plan. Shaw was waiting for an answer. The dismissal papers were probably already drafted. All Shaw had to do was sign them, send Brennan home, replace him with someone more obedient, someone who understood that field marshals did not get questioned. Brennan had two choices: back down or stand firm. He chose the only option that let him look at himself in the mirror. You have authority within British command, sir. You do not have authority over Canadian forces without triggering a political crisis that will land on General Eisenhower's desk, Prime Minister Churchill's desk, and Prime Minister King's desk simultaneously. Shaw's face went very still. Are you threatening me, General? I am stating facts. Brennan's voice was calm, level. The same tone he had used for 2 years in Ottawa offices making arguments to people who did not want to hear them. Try removing me from command, Field Marshal. You will meet the Dominion, not a letter. The whole government, every political consequence that comes with it. The silence that followed was the longest 30 seconds of Harold Brennan's life. Shaw's hand moved toward the papers on his desk, hovered there, then stopped. His eyes stayed on Brennan's face, looking for a crack, for uncertainty, for any sign that the 5 words were a bluff. Brennan did not blink. Finally, Shaw spoke. 2 words, quiet, deadly. Get out. Brennan stood, saluted, turned, walked out of the tent. His hands did not start shaking until he was 50 yards away. He had won. He had stood in front of the most powerful British general in Europe and said no, and Shaw had backed down. But the cost of that victory was still to come, because Shaw was not a man who forgot. And the war was not over. And somewhere in the weeks ahead, Brennan would learn exactly what it meant to defy an empire and survive. He touched his breast pocket, felt the folded papers there, those 907 names, and now one more reason to carry them. The boys had died at Dieppe under British command with no Canadian say in the plan. That would never happen again, not while Harold Brennan was breathing, not while he had the authority to say 5 words that made empires hesitate. Try it. Meet the Dominion. September 1944, Antwerp, Belgium. The port sat empty. 1,000 cranes, 20 miles of docks, warehouses large enough to swallow city blocks, capacity to unload 40,000 tons of supplies every single day. Everything the Allied armies needed to push into Germany and end the war. Empty. The city had been liberated on September the 4th. Canadian and British forces had rolled in to find the port intact. The Germans had retreated so fast they had not had time to destroy the infrastructure. Docks undamaged, cranes operational, rail connections still functional. It was a strategic miracle. The kind of prize that generals pray for and rarely receive. Every Allied army from Normandy to the German border was choking on a supply crisis. Trucks were driving round-trip distances of 600 miles just to keep frontline units fed and armed. Entire armoured divisions sat motionless because there was no fuel to move them. The war machine was grinding to a halt for lack of gasoline and ammunition and food. Antwerp could solve all of it. One port, one supply line, the whole campaign back on track. But the port sat empty, because between Antwerp and the North Sea stretched 54 miles of the Scheldt estuary, and Germans controlled both banks of that water. No ship could reach the port without sailing through German guns. Every military analyst who looked at the problem reached the same conclusion. Clear the Scheldt, first open the port, second. Do it now before the Germans have time to dig in deeper. Field Marshal Bernard Shaw had other plans. Harold Brennan stood in Shaw's headquarters tent on September the 15th, looking at maps that showed something called Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault, 3 divisions of paratroopers dropping into Holland to seize bridges across the Rhine. Ambitious, bold. The kind of operation that would make history books if it worked. This will end the war by Christmas, Shaw said. He was animated, energized. His finger traced the route north through Holland. We take the bridges, we cross the Rhine, we drive into Germany's industrial heart. The whole Wehrmacht collapses. Brennan looked at the map. Then he looked at the other map on the wall, the one showing Antwerp and the Scheldt. Sir, Brennan said carefully, What about the Scheldt intelligence reports say clearing it should be the immediate priority? Shaw did not look at him. The Scheldt can wait. This opportunity cannot. Every week we wait, the Germans fortify more positions, flood more terrain, make the clearing operation more costly. Now Shaw looked at him. The same cold look from 2 weeks ago when Brennan had missed the conference. Are you questioning my strategic judgment, General? Brennan thought about the names in his pocket, about what happened when generals made plans without thinking about the cost in boys' lives. I am stating concerns, sir. The supply crisis is severe. Antwerp could solve it. Market Garden is uncertain. Market Garden will succeed. Shaw's voice had an edge. And when it does, we will not need Antwerp. We will be in Germany. The war will be over. Brennan said nothing. There was nothing to say. Shaw had made his decision. The rest of the Allied command structure would follow, because that was how armies worked. You did not argue with field marshals. You saluted and executed orders. But Brennan pulled out a notebook and wrote down the date. September 15th, 1944. The day Shaw chose glory over logistics. The day the clock started ticking on how many boys would die for that choice. Operation Market Garden launched on September the 17th. Brennan watched the reports come in from his own headquarters, thousands of paratroopers dropping into Holland. Initial success, bridges captured, the advance pushing north. Then the reports started going wrong. German resistance heavier than expected. British paratroopers at Arnhem surrounded. Supply drops falling into German hands. The advance stalling. By September the 25th, it was over. The bridge at Arnhem, the final objective, remained in German hands. British losses: 1,485 dead, 6,525 captured. The operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas had failed catastrophically. Shaw issued a terse statement about the bravery of the paratroopers and the valuable lessons learned. Then he ordered the Scheldt cleared. Finally, 3 weeks after Antwerp had been captured, 3 weeks the Germans had used to prepare. Brennan received the intelligence briefings in early October. They were worse than he had feared. The Germans had opened the dikes. The low-lying polders of the Netherlands and Belgium farmland, kept dry by centuries of Dutch engineering, were now flooded. Cold seawater covered fields for miles. The few roads and causeways that remained above water were obvious, predictable, zeroed in by German artillery. Defensive positions that could have been taken in September with moderate casualties would now require frontal assaults through freezing water against entrenched machine guns and mortars. The intelligence officer giving the briefing was young, too young to have the kind of news he was delivering. Casualties estimated at 10 to 12,000, sir, possibly higher if weather deteriorates. Brennan looked at the maps, looked at the flooded terrain. Looked at the positions his army would have to assault. How many casualties if we had started in early September? The intelligence officer hesitated. Difficult to estimate, sir, but significantly fewer. The flooding alone changes the entire tactical picture. Brennan dismissed the officer, sat alone with the maps. 10 to 12,000 casualties, maybe more. Because Shaw had wanted a bridge in Holland instead of a port in Belgium, because glory mattered more than supply lines, because generals made decisions that other people's nephews paid for. He pulled out writing paper, started a letter to his sister, Beatrice. Dearest B, they are sending us into the Scheldt next week. The terrain is bad, worse than Normandy in some ways, water and mud and cold. I think of Nate often these days. I think of all the boys. Shaw chose a different operation first. Market Garden. It failed. The delay has made the Scheldt much harder. I estimate we will take 10,000 casualties, perhaps more. A significant portion of those casualties are preventable. They are the direct cost of 3 weeks' delay. I do not know if you want to hear this, but I need to write it to someone. Your Tommy and 10,000 more boys will pay for one man's decision to chase glory instead of winning the war the hard way. I will do everything in my power to bring them home. But I cannot undo 3 weeks. I cannot unflood the polders. I can only carry their names when it is over. Your brother, Harold. He sealed the letter, did not send it. Beatrice did not need to carry his burden. She had enough of her own. But writing it helped, put into words what he could not say in staff meetings or operational briefings. Shaw had made a choice. Boys would die for it. And when this was over, Brennan would make sure everyone knew exactly what that choice had cost. October 6th, 1944, the Scheldt offensive began. 50,000 men. Canadian divisions, British formations, Polish armoured units, Belgian soldiers. A multinational army under Harold Brennan's command ordered to clear 54 miles of flooded hell against 12,000 dug-in German defenders who had spent 3 weeks preparing to kill them. Brennan visited the front line the day before the assault. He did not do it for show. He did it because he needed to see the terrain, needed to look at the boys who would walk into it. The forward positions were 3 miles from German lines, muddy trenches, sandbagged positions, men cleaning weapons and checking equipment with the careful attention of soldiers who know they are about to need everything to work perfectly. Brennan walked among them. No ceremony, no speeches, just a general in a mud-covered coat watching boys who reminded him of Nate. One soldier was sitting on the edge of a trench cleaning his rifle, 19, maybe 20 years old, blonde hair. Calgary accent when he spoke to the soldier next to him. Brennan stopped. "What is your name? Private?" The soldier looked up, scrambled to attention. "Private Callum Reed, sir, Calgary Regiment." The same regiment Nate had died in, the same accent, almost the same age. "You are a long way from Calgary, Private Reed." "Yes, sir. But so is the war." Brennan almost smiled. "Indeed. You have family back home." "Mother and 2 sisters, sir. Father died in 38. I am the man of the house now." Reed said it with the kind of pride that boys have when they do not yet understand what being a man actually costs. "Your mother must worry." "I write her every week, sir. Tell her I am fine." "Are you fine?" Reed hesitated, then gave the honest answer instead of the expected one. "No, sir. I am cold and wet and scared, but I will do my job." Brennan wanted to tell him to stay low, stay smart. Do not be brave when being careful will keep you breathing. But that was not the kind of thing generals said to privates before an assault. So instead, he said the only thing he could. "You remind me of someone. My nephew. He died at Dieppe." Reed's face changed. Every Canadian soldier knew what Dieppe meant. "I am sorry, sir. So am I." Brennan paused. "Stay smart tomorrow, Private Reed. The war needs you alive more than it needs you dead." "Yes, sir." Brennan walked on, visited more positions, spoke with more boys, saw more faces that reminded him of Nate. That night he returned to his headquarters tent, pulled out his folded papers, looked at the 907 names. Tomorrow that number would start climbing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it except make sure the boys fought smart and came home alive whenever possible. He added a note to his operational diary. 1 line. Private. Not for official record. If I survive this, I will make sure Shaw's decision is remembered. Every casualty, every name. The world will know what 3 weeks cost. Then he tried to sleep, failed, waited for dawn and the assault. The reports came in over 6 weeks, each one a ledger of names and numbers that Brennan read like other men read newspapers. Week 1, 2,400 Canadian casualties, 3 miles of flooded polder taken, German resistance fierce, water chest deep in most assault areas, temperature dropping, cases of hypothermia increasing. Week 2, Polish Armoured Division assault South Beveland Island, 800 casualties, position secured. General Stanislaw Radek sends personal note to Brennan. Your boys fight like lions. It is an honour to serve under you. Week 3, British units assault Walcheren Island. Initial attacks, stall, heavy casualties. Brennan personally reorganizes the attack plan, commits Canadian reserves, the island falls. Week 4, breakthrough. German defensive line collapses. The retreat begins. November 8, 1944, Scheldt estuary cleared. All German positions eliminated or captured. The final casualty count came 3 days later. Brennan read it in his tent with a bottle of whiskey he did not drink and a hand that shook for the first time since August. First, Canadian Army, 12,873 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing. Polish Division, 2,077 casualties. British units, 3,000 plus casualties. Total Allied cost for 54 miles of river, approximately 18,000 men. Brennan pulled out his folded papers, started writing names. Not all of them. That would take days. But the ones he knew. The ones whose faces he remembered. Reed Callum, private, Calgary Regiment, age 20. K. October 12th stepped on mine in flooded field north of Breskens. The intelligence officer had brought that report personally. Reed had been advancing with his platoon through chest-deep water. Stepped wrong. The mine detonated underwater. His body was not recovered for 3 days. Brennan added Reed's name to his list. Thought about the boy's mother in Calgary. About the letters she would stop receiving. About the telegram that was probably already on its way. He thought about the intelligence estimate from early October. 10 to 12,000 casualties. The actual number had been slightly higher, but close enough. And he thought about the estimate of how many casualties could have been prevented if the Scheldt had been cleared in early September instead of mid-October. 4 to 6,000 lives. Preventable. The direct cost of Market Garden's failure and 3 weeks' delay. 4 to 6,000 boys who had died in freezing water because one general wanted glory more than he wanted logistics. Brennan sat with that number for a long time. Then he pulled out fresh paper and started writing his official after-action report, the one that would go to every level of Allied command, the one Shaw could not suppress because regulations required it. He wrote it the way he wrote everything. Precise, factual, devastating. Operations in the Scheldt estuary, October to November 1944. Total casualties, 12,873 Canadian, 2,077. Polish, 3,000, plus British. Delay in commencement of operations directly attributable to prioritization of Operation Market Garden. German defensive preparations during delay period increased tactical difficulty and casualty estimates by 30 to 40%. Estimate of 4,000 to 6,000 preventable Allied casualties directly resulting from delayed start of Scheldt operations. Operation Market Garden priority decision constitutes strategic error with significant cost in Allied lives. He read it over 3 times. Changed nothing. Signed it. Sealed it. Sent copies to Eisenhower's headquarters, Shaw's headquarters, Canadian Prime Minister's office, British War Office. Shaw would see it. Shaw would know exactly what Brennan was saying. Shaw would understand that this was not just a report. It was an accusation. A formal official statement that Shaw's decision had killed boys unnecessarily. The response came 2 days later. A summons to Shaw's headquarters, November 10th, 1944. The headquarters tent was the same as it had been in August. Maps on the walls. Heater running. But the warmth felt different now. Hostile. Shaw stood behind his desk. No offer to sit this time. Your report. Shaw held up the document. This report questions my strategic judgment. Publicly. Officially. It states, facts, sir. It states your opinion dressed as facts. Preventable casualties. Strategic error. These are not objective assessments. These are accusations. Brennan met his eyes. They are accurate assessments based on casualty data and intelligence estimates. 12,873 Canadians earned the truth about why they died. I will not lie in an official report to spare anyone's reputation. Shaw's face went very still. "Withdraw this report." "No, sir. That was not a request, General. That was an order." "An order I cannot follow, sir. The report is factually accurate. It has been distributed through proper channels. Withdrawing it would constitute falsification of an official military document. You are questioning the decision of your superior officer in writing. That is insubordination. I am documenting the operational costs of strategic decisions. That is my responsibility as a field commander." Shaw stepped around the desk, stood close enough that Brennan could see the veins in his neck, the anger in his eyes. "I will make sure every general in Europe knows you are insubordinate, difficult, impossible to work with. Your career will end the day this war ends. You will never command anything again." Brennan thought about the Dieppe dead, about the 12,873 from Scheldt, about Callum Reid stepping on a mine in freezing water because Shaw had needed 3 extra weeks to learn that glory does not win wars. "And I will make sure every historian who studies this campaign knows exactly why those boys died, sir. You can end my career. But you cannot change what the casualty lists say. You cannot unwrite this report. Too many copies exist. Too many people have already seen it." The silence stretched. Shaw's hands were fists at his sides. Finally he spoke. Quiet, cold. "Get out of my sight." Brennan saluted, turned, walked out. His hands shook again. But this time it was not fear. It was something else. Anger, maybe. Or grief. Or the exhaustion of fighting 2 wars at once, one against the Germans, one against the people who should have been on his side. He had defied Shaw twice now. August 19th, November 10th. Each time he had said no when saying yes would have been easier. Each time he had survived. But Shaw was not done with him. Brennan knew that. You do not accuse a field marshal of getting boys killed unnecessarily and walk away without consequences. The consequences would come later, after the war, in memoirs and historical accounts and the quiet ways that powerful men destroy the reputations of people who challenge them. But for now the boys had the truth. The casualty lists had context. The official record showed what Market Garden's delay had cost. That would have to be enough. November the 28th, 1944, the first Allied convoys sailed into Antwerp. 85 days after the port had been captured. 85 days of empty docks and idle cranes, while the supply crisis deepened and boys died in water for lack of what those ships carried. Brennan did not attend the ceremony. He had no stomach for celebration, not when he knew the cost of every day that port had sat empty. He stayed in his headquarters tent, wrote letters to families, signed casualty reports, added names to his list. By the end of November 1944, Harold Brennan carried 13,780 names in his breast pocket. Dieppe and Scheldt and all the small battles in between. 3 pages had become 8. The paper was wearing thin from being folded and unfolded. The ink was smudging, but the names were still legible, every single one. Brennan Nathaniel, Lieutenant, Calgary Regiment, age 22, Reed Callum, Private, Calgary Regiment, age 20, 907 from Dieppe, 12,873 from Scheldt. His nephew and 13,779 other boys who had trusted that the generals making decisions knew what those decisions cost. Brennan had tried to protect them, had fought Shaw twice to give them a voice, had written reports that told the truth about how they died. It had not been enough. It would never be enough, but it was all he could do. The war continued. The fighting pushed into Germany, and Harold Brennan carried his names and waited for the moment when the world would ask him to account for what he had seen and what he had done. That moment was still years away, but it was coming, and when it came, Brennan would be ready. The war ended in May 1945. Harold Brennan stood in a field in northern Germany and watched German officers sign surrender documents. The fighting was over. The killing had stopped. 2 million Allied soldiers would start going home. Brennan was 57 years old, too old for the celebration happening around him, too tired to feel anything except a quiet relief that it was finished. He touched his breast pocket. The papers were still there. Thicker now, 13,780 names written in ink that had faded from months of being carried. The paper had torn along one of the fold lines. He had mended it with tape. The names were what mattered, not the victory, not the surrender, just the accounting of what victory had cost in boys who would never see this day. Brennan went home to Canada in June. No parade, no ceremony, just a transport ship across the Atlantic and a train from Halifax to Ottawa. His wife Eleanor met him at the station, 58 years old, grey hair, the same quiet strength that had kept her writing letters every 3 days for 5 years of war. She did not ask about the fighting, did not ask about Shaw or Scheldt or any of it. She just held him for a long time on the platform, while other families reunited around them. "You carried them all the way home," she said quietly. She meant the names. She had always known about the names. "Yes," Brennan said, "all the way home." They went back to their house in Ottawa. Small, quiet. A garden Eleanor had maintained alone. Brennan spent the first weeks doing nothing except sleeping and reading and trying to remember what peacetime felt like. But the war followed him. It always does, in dreams, in the way sudden sounds made his hand shake, in the habit of checking his breast pocket 20 times a day to make sure the names were still there, and in the knowledge that the accounting was not finished, not yet. 13 years passed. Harold Brennan retired from the military in 1946, took a quiet position in the Department of National Defense. Paperwork, budgets, the same kind of work he had done before Dieppe changed everything. He did not talk about the war much, did not give interviews, did not write memoirs. Other generals did that. The ones who wanted to be remembered. Brennan just wanted to live quietly with Eleanor and tend his garden and forget the sound of artillery. But in 1958, Bernard Shaw published his memoirs. The book was thick, comprehensive. Shaw's account of the war from North Africa through Normandy to Germany. Critics praised it as essential reading. Military historians called it definitive. Brennan bought a copy, read it in his study over 3 evenings, each page making him angrier than the last. Shaw's account of the Scheldt was brief, 3 pages out of 600. Factual, dry, no mention of Market Garden's delay, no acknowledgement of preventable casualties, just a clinical description of the operation and its success, and 1 paragraph about the 1st Canadian Army's performance. General Harold Brennan commanded the 1st Canadian Army with adequate competence, though the force required more direct supervision than anticipated. Brennan himself lacked the grip necessary for high command in challenging circumstances. The Scheldt operations were satisfactory, but unimaginative. Canadian casualties, while regrettable, were within acceptable ranges for the tactical objectives achieved. Brennan read that paragraph 5 times. Adequate competence, required supervision. Lacked grip. Satisfactory but unimaginative. Acceptable ranges. 13,780 boys reduced to acceptable ranges. Their deaths catalogued as satisfactory results achieved by a commander who lacked grip. No mention of Brennan's report. No acknowledgement of the 4,000 to 6,000 preventable casualties. No admission that Shaw's strategic vanity had cost lives. Just a quiet dismissal. A historical footnote that made Brennan sound like a mediocre officer who had been carried to success by superior British leadership. Eleanor found him that evening, still sitting in his study, the book open on his lap. "What does he say?" she asked. "That the boys died in acceptable ranges, that I lacked grip." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you respond?" Brennan thought about it, thought about writing his own memoir, setting the record straight, fighting Shaw in print the way he had fought him in person, but he was 70 years old. tired, done with fighting. "No," he said, "let him have his version. The casualty lists tell a different story. Anyone who wants the truth can read those. And if they do not, then they were never looking for truth in the first place." He closed the book, put it on a shelf, tried to forget about it, but the anger stayed, quiet, burning. The kind that does not fade because it is built on 13,780 names that Shaw had dismissed as acceptable ranges. 4 years later, the truth started fighting back without Brennan having to lift a hand. August 19, 1962, the 20th anniversary of Dieppe. The Canadian government organized a memorial service. Veterans were invited to speak. The press covered it. Politicians gave speeches about sacrifice and remembrance. One of the speakers was a high school history teacher from Calgary, middle-aged, unremarkable-looking. He walked to the podium with the careful steps of a man whose leg had been badly injured once and never quite healed right. His name was James Keller. He had been at Dieppe, 19 years old, one of the survivors. "I carried a man off that beach," Keller said into the microphone. His voice was steady, teacher's voice, used to being heard. "Corporal Michael Davies. He died in my arms before we reached the boats. I took his dog tags, carried them for 2 years before I finally sent them to his mother." Keller paused, looked out at the crowd. "General Harold Brennan carried Michael Davies too, not his body, his name. For 2 years General Brennan kept a list of everyone who died at Dieppe. He carried it in his pocket every day, all 907 names." The crowd was silent, listening. 20 years ago today, General Brennan chose to attend this memorial instead of a meeting with Field Marshal Shaw. Shaw tried to remove him from command for that choice. Brennan said 5 words that saved his career and proved something important. He said, "Try it. Meet the Dominion." Keller's voice got stronger. Field Marshal Shaw published his memoirs 4 years ago. He called Brennan adequate, said he lacked grip, called our casualties acceptable ranges. "I want the Field Marshal to know something. The man he called adequate fought for us twice, once to remember Dieppe, once to tell the truth about Scheldt. The man, he said, lacked grip, stood up to an empire when empire said, 'Obey.' And those acceptable ranges, those were my friends, my brothers, men whose names General Brennan carried while Shaw was writing about his own greatness." The speech made newspapers. Canadian press picked it up. The phrase, "Try it. Meet the Dominion," started appearing in headlines. Veterans wrote letters to editors. The story of Brennan's confrontation with Shaw became public knowledge. Shaw, living in retirement in England, issued no comment. Brennan, reading the newspaper coverage in his Ottawa home, felt something he had not felt in years, not vindication exactly, but a sense that the boys finally had voices, that their names were being said aloud by people who had known them. Eleanor found him in the study again. This time he was smiling. "They remember," he said. "The boys remember." "They always did," Eleanor said. "You just needed to wait long enough for them to speak." The historians came next. In 1963, 2 Canadian military historians named Dennis and Sheila Whitaker published a comprehensive study of the Scheldt campaign. Both were veterans. Both had been there. Their analysis was meticulous, footnoted, based on casualty reports and operational documents and interviews with survivors. Their conclusion was devastating to Shaw's reputation. The delay in commencing Scheldt operations was directly attributable to Shaw's decision to prioritize Operation Market Garden. German defensive preparations during the delay increased Allied casualties by an estimated 30 to 40%. 4,000 to 6,000 lives were lost unnecessarily. The decision to delay constituted a strategic error driven by Shaw's desire for a dramatic victory rather than sound logistical planning. The book cited Brennan's after-action report extensively, quoted from it, validated its conclusions. More than that, It told the story of Brennan's confrontation with Shaw in August 1944, the memorial service, the meeting, the 5 words, the whole account drawn from interviews with officers who had been there. The book became required reading in Canadian military colleges. Historians studying the Normandy campaign started citing it. Shaw's memoirs, once considered definitive, were now read alongside accounts that called his judgment into question. Shaw, now 76 years old, watched his legacy crack. Letters appeared in British military journals defending his decisions. Former staff officers wrote rebuttals. But the casualty numbers did not change. 4,000 to 6,000 preventable deaths. The evidence was in the official records. No amount of defending could erase it. In late 1963, Shaw did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to Harold Brennan, private, handwritten, mailed to Brennan's Ottawa address. General Brennan. I have read the recent historical analyses of the Scheldt campaign. I have noted the characterization of my decisions. I wonder if you would be willing to meet. Not for public consumption, simply 2 old soldiers discussing matters that perhaps should have been discussed years ago. I will be in London through the spring. If you are willing, I would welcome the conversation. Bernard Shaw. Brennan showed the letter to Eleanor. Will you go? She asked. I do not know. What is left to say? Maybe that is what you need to find out. Brennan thought about it for 3 days. Then he wrote back accepting the meeting. Not because he forgave Shaw, not because he wanted reconciliation, but because carrying 13,780 names for 22 years had taught him something about the weight of the past. Maybe Shaw carried weight too. Maybe they both needed to set it down. March 1964. London. Shaw's flat was in Kensington, 4th floor, overlooking a quiet street, the kind of place retired field marshals lived when the war was over and the headlines had moved on. Shaw answered the door himself. No aid, no ceremony, just an old man in a cardigan thinner than Brennan remembered face, lined with age. General Brennan, thank you for coming. Field Marshal. They sat in Shaw's living room. Tea service on the table between them. Afternoon light coming through windows that looked out on London rooftops. 2 old men who had once commanded armies. Now, just 2 old men with tea. Shaw poured. His hand shook slightly. Parkinson's, maybe. Or just age. I have been reading the histories, Shaw said. The Whitaker's book, the analyses, they are rather unkind to my decisions. They are accurate, Brennan said. Shaw was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, I suppose they are. He set down his teacup. Market Garden could have worked. It did not. No, it did not. And while I chased bridges, your boys drowned in Dutch polders. 4,000 to 6,000 of them. Preventable casualties. Your report was correct about that. Brennan said nothing, just waited. Shaw looked at him, really looked. The way he had not looked in that headquarters tent in August 1944, when he had been too angry to see anything except insubordination. I never apologized, Shaw said quietly, for trying to remove you, for dismissing your concerns, for what I wrote in my memoirs. I am doing so now. I was wrong. About your grip, about your ability. You were the right man for that command. Better than I gave you credit for. The words hung in the air, an apology 20 years late, sincere as far as Brennan could tell, but also insufficient. I accept your apology, Field Marshal, but Callum Reid cannot. Nathaniel Brennan cannot. 12,873 boys cannot. They are the ones who paid for Market Garden, not me. I know. Shaw's voice was barely a whisper. I think about that more than you would imagine. The names, the casualty reports. I told myself they were necessary costs, acceptable ranges. But late at night, when I cannot sleep, I wonder if I was simply lying to myself. You were, Brennan said. Not cruelly, just factually. We all lie to ourselves in war. It is how we survive making decisions that kill boys. But the lies do not change the truth. Shaw nodded slowly. Why did you really try to fire me? Brennan asked. It was not just about the memorial service. Shaw was quiet for a long time. Then he gave the honest answer. You scared me. Not as a soldier, as a symbol. If Canada could say no to British command, what would that mean? Australia saying no, New Zealand, India, the entire empire saying, we are not yours to order anymore. I was fighting to hold on to something that was already slipping away. An empire dying, a world changing, and you were proof that it was happening whether I liked it or not. Brennan thought about that, about what his 5 words had really meant. Not just defiance, but the sound of an old order breaking, the death rattle of imperial command. I was not fighting for empire, Brennan said. I was fighting for boys with names, not bodies, not acceptable ranges, names. That is the difference between us, Field Marshal. You saw soldiers as pieces on a map. I saw them as nephews. And that is why the boys remember you, Shaw said quietly. Why they speak your name with respect. Why the histories are kinder to you than to me. They sat in silence for a while. Tea getting cold. Afternoon light shifting. Finally Shaw spoke again. What will history remember me for? Brennan considered the question, gave the truthful answer. Alamein, Normandy, the general who beat Rommel, that is not nothing. And you, 5 words, try it. Meet the Dominion and 12,873 boys who came home because I stood in the right rooms at the right times and said no when empire said obey. Shaw smiled, sad, tired. The smile of a man who understood he had lost more than battles. You won then, not the war. That took all of us. But the thing that mattered, the boys remember you. That is victory. They finished their tea, shook hands, said goodbye with the formality of old soldiers who had found a kind of peace but would never be friends. Brennan took a taxi back to his hotel, sat in his room, pulled out the folded papers from his jacket pocket. The names were still there, faded, worn, but legible. He had carried them across a continent, through a war, into peacetime, through 22 years of remembering. Maybe it was time to let someone else carry them for a while. Harold Brennan died on April the 3rd, 1976, 88 years old, heart failure, peaceful, Eleanor beside him. His funeral was held in Ottawa. 3,000 people attended, veterans, politicians, ordinary Canadians who had read the stories and wanted to pay respects to the general who had said 5 words that changed what it meant to be Canadian. The Prime Minister gave the eulogy. General Brennan proved that Canada is sovereign through one sentence. Try it. Meet the Dominion. We are a nation because men like him said no when empires said obey. We are free because he understood that soldiers have names, not numbers. We remember him because he never forgot us. The casket was carried by veterans from the Scheldt campaign, old men now, white-haired, moving slowly, but standing straight as they bore him to his grave. In his uniform pocket, folded carefully, were 8 pages covered in faded ink, 13,780 names. The papers were buried with him, a memorial that no one would see except the earth. But the story did not end there. November 8th, 1994, Zeeland, Netherlands, 50th anniversary of the Scheldt liberation. Canadian veterans returned, not many. Most were gone. The few who remained were in their 70s and 80s, moving slowly, remembering quickly. Dutch civilians met them, older now too, but they remembered. They remembered the water receding, the Germans retreating, the Canadians liberating farmland that had been flooded and occupied. You freed us from the flood and the occupation both, a Dutch woman told one veteran. We never forgot. In Ottawa, the Canadian War Museum opened a new permanent exhibit, the Brennan Room, dedicated to the general who had stood up to empire and won. The centerpiece was a glass case containing documents, Brennan's after-action report, Shaw's letter of apology, Eleanor's letters from the war, and 8 pages of faded handwritten names, Dieppe and Scheldt, 13,780 boys who had died far from home. Nathaniel Brennan's name was circled in red ink. So was Callum Reid's. A plaque beside the case read, "To General Harold Brennan, the clerk who became a lion, the commander who said 5 words that made an empire blink, try it. Meet the Dominion." Present day. 2024, Canadian War Museum, Ottawa. A school group tours the Brennan Room. 12-year-olds, bored until the guide starts telling the story. In 1944, the guide says, this general told the most powerful British commander in the war that firing him would mean meeting the entire Canadian government, not a letter, the whole Dominion, and the British general backed down. One student raises her hand. Why did he carry all those names? The guide looks at the glass case, at the faded papers with 13,780 names in ink that has barely survived 80 years. Because he knew they were not numbers. They were nephews and sons and brothers, and he refused to let anyone forget that. The students look at the names. So many names, filling every inch of 8 pages, written in the careful handwriting of a man who understood that remembering was the only power the dead have left. Did it matter? Another student asks. What he did. The guide thinks about that, about Harold Brennan standing in a headquarters tent saying 5 words, about Shaw backing down, about Canada becoming a nation that could say no to empires, about 13,780 boys whose names were remembered because one general refused to call them acceptable ranges. Yes, the guide says, it mattered. It still matters. Because every Canadian who wears the uniform today stands in the space General Brennan created when he said, try it. Meet the Dominion. He proved we were a nation, not a colony, and he did it by remembering names. So the students move on to the next exhibit, but one stays behind, looks at the names, tries to imagine what it was like to carry 13,780 people everywhere you went. The glass case holds the names, the museum holds the story, and somewhere in the ground outside Ottawa, an old general rests with the boys he carried all the way home. Bernard Shaw died in 1976, 3 months after Brennan. The obituaries called him a brilliant strategist, a complicated leader. A general who won battles but lost arguments with history. The boys remember both men, but only one of them do they remember with love. Harold Brennan never fired a shot in combat, never led a charge, never won a dramatic victory that made headlines. He just stood in rooms when it mattered and said 5 words that made empires hesitate. Try it. Meet the Dominion. And 13,780 boys went home with their names carried by a man who understood they were not numbers, not statistics, not acceptable ranges. They were nephews, and they deserved to be remembered.